You should subject Rava.
Yeah.
What they did at Sar song telling?
Ye something banal. Some sochik, huh? Now dungal pog to me, yes. Tene, some soningi, con mazi with jig, some inting aven at the land.
Chive dungal pacamate.
John Den Jambe Yung La Cha Za Loi Konge Lo De Demye Tender Nyedara Nam Darab Sarave Jinye Dungun Chejen Zich Nije Tugra Le Woman Zen Konda Sibe Zunr Mare Mentam Dungra Chizeve Rosoy Gon La Puje Tarz Yen La Duje Yung De Son Tudara Chedo Nyamon Yelon Leje Jodon Roze Jene Mare Mes Dungra Nyugo Chenye Chenze Raje Nam Dene Tajin Saju Tarsen Yenden Luzo Yase Tuvu Ko Chödrak Chödrak Chöni Jende Dalum Zenjambe Yung La Endu Amarabazana de Amarabazana Amarabazana de Aramzana de Ramzana 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 Amramzana de Ramzana de Ramzana de Ramzana de Ramzana de Ramzana de Ramzana Amarabazana de Ramzana 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 Amarabazana de Ramzana 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 de Amarabazana de Ramzana 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 Amarabazana de Chadin Jeje Chenra Vizraje Dalu de Muhammad Barabsrane Kadon Tenju Yonglu Topaye Loje Pobe Nonwa Saltu Sol Temra Jurwan Rola Penye Ba Temba Deshi Choklan Gu Shatsal Tokbe Chawa Nam Sreshin Sabdan Jashi Kungawa Kundu Zongbe Srachai Kunne Chola Ingu Sha Chawa Jamya Shana Durje Jenrese Sayin Nimbo Devan Nambrasar Namgen Nimbo Shamba Kundu Zong Nyewe Seshin Jel Gusha Chawa Shadong Kolo Gyurve Gyarbo Jindong Karba Zongbe Sangye Tang Gongla Gondru Tela Tertenbe Zamba Jinre Ziglan Gusha Chawa Tserp Kundu Sije Tanye Le Tamge Samu Shagi Yong Zongshin Shanjum Nimbe Lamken Karma Ba Mije De Jivu Zuge Du Lasso Tambe Chu Sinangen Namba Ninje Yongge Tene Kuncho Sumla Japsun Rove Lodang Shanchub Sem Yes Tembe Gone Tambe Chu Zero Nang.
So please listen attentively to the explanations that are to be given, having first taken refuge in the three jewels and having recollected the body-mind.
Lasso, tene, teche yon de tanganzo, trin kabale de yosana, tawa kata ki sakje yiginan ne, sakje tamje ne dungalawa singe, ti katu de pedemate.
So we're continuing the explanations of the second of the four seals, where it is stated that that which makes for falling into worldly existences is of the nature of suffering.
Tati che yon te sakje ji dungal sangeta la chaban dushi ji dunge jobe dunge ji dunge te sum thabachige nang la dune nang ba sanje sung du.
And in Buddhism, as has been explained in the previous session, there is a categorization of suffering into three basic types. One, or the first of the three, is that of so-called ever-present suffering, or suffering, the kind of suffering which is part and parcel of each and every single thing in worldly existences. The second of the three types of suffering is suffering because of change, and the third is about what one may refer perhaps to as cumulative suffering. There is suffering upon suffering upon suffering. So it's suffering in the context of the suffering in question being one of a very high degree.
Penna dujem meta pa yimba tan sakje dungal ba yimba thi ngacho ngote ne khari chagu yarsana ko de dujem meta pa yimba tan sakje dungal yimba te ngope chuni re.
Now, what's the purpose of pointing out that things that are the outcome of causes and conditions are impermanent, and that all things in worldly existences are of the nature of suffering? Why is this information given, as it were? Why are people encouraged to recognize what was just said? Well, the purpose of it is to make individuals see the facts of life, because that all things resulting from a number of causes and conditions are impermanent is a fact, and that all things in worldly existences are of the nature of suffering are also a fact. So it's a matter of pointing to the facts of worldly existences.
Penangaranzo korwa thongmame bitune tande luden de pardu ngaranso dadu tawe namto nyambade no tenne daji yojo taje di namto nyambade de la tenne sakje ke lesa
da sakje ke lesa va sakpar chepe shiti pungpungarwa
njere
tene da de punga la daktati jarne tene lesa gerwa
ya
tene da lesak begjut sovo de dansin rese gore punga rese gore condition. Dansin de rava.
Dansin ten nyomung ten lesa algo yorwa. Ta tinte sene ngajo korwal cham de bare.
Alltså.
Dik champnon rabote sakje dungali baya hamago.
Alltså.
Sakje ke nekap devate metapa baya hamago ne ngajo khorde bare. Tan tenso gene ngajo chi ya ni ga masona chi se matum na.
Now, since time immemorial, till now, this lifetime, we have taken rebirth in all sorts of worldly existences, simply because of believing in an individual self, the individual self being the primary object of attention in terms of the mindset of a worldly individual. And because of the belief in a self, afflictive, obscuring states happen. And once those states have surfaced, the worldly individual enacts those states, thus accumulating karma, which in turn will determine the circumstances of this individual's future. So, since time immemorial, we have gone from one rebirth to the next because of what was just described. And because of the belief in a self and the resulting afflictive, obscuring states, we fail to recognize the facts of life. The fact that whatever occurs in worldly existences is of the nature of suffering. And the fact that the temporary periods of well-being, happiness, and the like we experience are impermanent. This we also fail to recognize, and instead we become attached to these states, and we suffer when those states or circumstances come to an end, simply because of the mindset described, which blinds one to the point where one no longer sees the facts of suffering, nor the facts of impermanence. So the purpose of giving the information about the true facts is to enable individuals to recognize these facts, and in consequence of having recognized these facts, there will be, by way of using the methods of the Buddhist path, a progressive process where attachments decrease in terms of their strength. Attachments can progressively be eradicated in terms of what one is attached to within one's worldly existence, as well as our notion of things as having a lasting nature. That notion is also impacted because of seeing that the facts about all things is, or the fact rather about all things is that each and everything is impermanent. There is nothing that ever lasts throughout time except for a brief period.
Penna kajen de gongken yang do. Ta sakje korben nela dene dechi zan meveres. Megin jikten dechi duga singet den do.
There are individuals who object and say, well, it's not as if suffering is ever present in worldly existences. Yes, there is suffering from time to time. However, by and large, life is okay and sometimes quite pleasant.
Ata ne kap sam samatang bina ten je. Penna la yin jekten la dewa manggo yue devare me yin jekten la dewa yue devare.
Well, in both the realm of gods and the world of human beings, there are or there is happiness, well-being, good circumstances and the like, particularly in the world or the worlds of gods, but also within the world of human beings, though it's certainly not all human beings who are in good circumstances and in a happy frame of mind, but yes, there are instances of and periods of well-being. And one can find instances of happiness, well-being and the like, good circumstances and so on, in the world of animals as well. However, with regard to all these existences, the good circumstances, the happiness, the well-being, whatever is at hand, is of an impermanent nature, doesn't last.
Kai mo kong se tin nang la tene promje look te tondu ne kap jil khal shimbu shidai war yene sonye de diabetes tak tak tu pekre tinde wa.
Khenpo takes himself as an example. He suffers from diabetes. Now, he is fond of drinking a cup of strong tea with some sugar in it. And while drinking that cup of tea with some sugar in it, there is a pleasant sensation. However, quite shortly after, he won't feel that well, perhaps. If he then were to measure his blood sugar levels, they would have gone up above the normal range. So it depends on how one looks at it. Is that cup of tea with sugar that enjoyable, though there is an enjoyable sensation while drinking it? But since it causes a bit of upheaval as to the blood sugar levels and therefore some discomfort later on, would one really say that in the case of Khenpo Rinpoche, drinking that cup of tea with some sugar in it, is it really that enjoyable? Having thought about the consequences, perhaps the sense of pleasure while drinking it is more like an illusion of pleasure. It isn't real pleasure because in fact the drink isn't good at all from the moment it's drunk. For the person who suffers from diabetes. So pleasure, happiness, well-being and so on that results from or that's derived from things in worldly existences aren't about true happiness. One could say it's about tainted happiness, and so then one has to ask oneself the question, is tainted happiness really happiness? Perhaps not.
Lasso, tate Torike Dungege the shade of Kabla, Tangan mid shade the
yesterday, in terms of the third type of suffering, suffering upon suffering, the sort of cumulative type of suffering, the explanations concerning this type of suffering in the world of human beings was begun yesterday.
Ta gebe dungal te shutsarache, gebe dungal shutsavache, nave dungal shutsavache, ta chive dungal la lever.
So that type of suffering in the context of birth, aging and disease was explained yesterday. Today Khenpo Rinpoche will continue the same explanations in the same context. However, to begin with respect to the process of death and dying.
Tiinde nganzo kamsum du jewachi lin san de zongde shigoju yimba jewa kabrana tasha tsawre mashi desa tsan yom.
Now, if one looks at the three basic levels of existence within an impure world system, wherever one is reborn, from the moment of birth, it is certain that one day one will have to face death. There isn't a single individual in any impure world system who've ever escaped death.
Junsin tenden tenne pena nyintu drachamba sochil chashana jewa yema kamsum de melingwa ge lijek jote yons pon songare mato.
And this is the very reason why in the Shravaka tradition, the main goal of practitioners is to attain the level of enlightenment called arhathood, at which point all causes for rebirth in any worldly existence have been relinquished.
Perna.
Mari chungru.
Pendu shubina. Perna drachamba. Tako ngöshe dan zuntur. Panga yuedewa pago sharipu drabuchi chashana yang. Pago sharipu ge lude Thoma lenyang topji Nalanda area le Jewel Longdoa. Tam dene kushak du yang lenyang pumbe lude yukchene. Dene gopala nyambar shayor mato yuk mugawa chene konamba so pesa yomare.
Kade yuk mugawa?
Lude yuk mugawa.
If we take the example of a well-known arhat, Shariputra, who had achieved high qualities in consequence of his realization, qualities concerned with so-called foreknowledge as well as a capacity for working what is usually known as miracles and the like. Now, he was born in a village close to the area named Nalanda, which one finds in today's state of Bihar in India. And at birth, in terms of Shariputra's person, as all other worldly individuals, his person was made up of the 5 psychophysical constituents known as the 5 skandhas in Sanskrit. And at his passing into nirvana at the end of his life, he left that body behind, or that existence behind, the existence which is about being made up of the 5 skandhas, a physical body, and then 4 basic mindsets, which makes for the workings of the worldly mind. So, in spite of Shariputra having attained arhathood during his lifetime, he, as all individuals who have taken rebirth in a worldly existence, had to leave the body of that life behind. So not even an arhat, someone who mind-wise is beyond worldly existences, is saved from having to be separated from the body of a lifetime, the physical body of a lifetime. And we're all the same. All of us will one day have to face the same situation where the physical body of a lifetime is lost. One is forced to leave one's most cherished possession, as it were, behind.
티인데 따치 외갑 동할 때 가리 어르스나 잠든데게 니에게 잡고 사잘라 담ben 도이나 튼들라 망고 쉬우지 송샤
Sula dambedo.
잘고 사잘라 담ben 도
Sajal.
사잘
Det jaga kelapa minne.
미시
Gampopa, in this context, in his Jewel Ornament of Liberation, quotes a sutra, a lecture given by Buddha Shakyamuni, where the Buddha gives a number of advice to a disciple who at the time was the king of one of the many kingdoms of the Indian subcontinent at the time, and the name of the king in the Tibetan translation is Sogyal.
테네 되게 던다던 돌
Sogyal ergo.
살잘
Salgyal.
야
Sorry, his name in the Tibetan translation is Salgyal.
오다티 너희 공동도 주도니 휴샤바이나 빨나 따라니 산이 치외 치와는 예용 betula 나랑 김비세 강보는 쌍샤베 윤어롱 저때게 양 나치와도 루투고 말해 제버려.
So to begin with, Buddha Shakyamuni pointed out to his disciple the king that at the time of death, one is forced to part with all that one has accumulated throughout a lifetime in terms of wealth and the like. One has to, or one is rather forced to leave everything behind.
나랑게 톱다 슈도 고네 가리에 같은 적 간가야 슈드 자야랑 됐어.
One also has to part from one's influence that one may have exerted over others throughout a lifetime, one's strength as to both body and mind. One has to part with one's social status and the like.
대는 내가 나신 게 나랑 그 부모 총마 딱 가리여버대 라는 제동진 게 가세 여버대양 슈르자는 로에레스.
And one has to part with all near and dear ones, family members, a spouse, sons, daughters, friends, and so on.
다 뒤값을 간대지 용거였으나 다 우기 좋아의 채다 가장 내쉬인 분한도 슈차비 다 우기 좋아의 채다 파도 랩용투.
And as was explained earlier in a previous session, both outer and inner respiration come to a halt at the time of death, and the mind of the deceased person exits from the physical body and enters the so-called in-between state, the state between death and a new rebirth.
다 뒤값라 너희 찍난데 송거도와 레저 롱마를 잡고 잡네 대 송거도와.
At which point the winds of karma pushes one ahead further and further into that state.
단 뒤값라 레간나 코랑 그 예수 로야레 마도 신칸체 메로와.
And at that point one is impacted by both previous non-virtuous actions and previous virtuous actions. So depending upon one's lifestyle, as it were, in the immediately preceding life as well as in other previous lives, circumstances are either horrific or perhaps something in between, or not that bad. It all depends upon the nature, one's circumstances in the in-between state, all depend upon the nature of one's previous actions.
Tande lando sikte che sumendo do kashen an sik de yong do net lo mata hu jamnete jigron mamba chimbe kone su songdo
de sikte college
de jigron jiksoro mata pardu semjen tan jikta chira yo che ten dawa chige don sur ngarang pepsu dawo de shugre jikta ga namba chi
in the Jewel Ornament of Liberation, there is just that phrase from this sutra. Khenpo Rinpoche says, if he remembers right, it's followed by another phrase, a phrase which says, and remember, one is, or the deceased individual is pushed ahead by the great force of the winds of one's personal karma, as it were, and ahead one is welcomed by, as it were, circumstances of great fear and panic.
Tande dek kabla ranke misigina the gewaya puche shabatan so yina.
Now, in terms of a deceased individual who's spent his immediately preceding life as well as other previous lives doing primarily virtue or dedicating his or her life to virtue, these individuals, by the power of the previous virtuous actions, will escape that fear and panic.
Tedu pardu semjentela nuate gayale tenerang gelamato yedam la sopa tenzo shenje ten tabushin to come and rotu.
They, rather than encountering circumstances that inspire fear and panic, encounter the manifestation of their guru, the manifestation of their yidam, and both or either of them guide the mind stream in the in-between state to a rebirth in a so-called Pure Land.
Tene Java Shamana double two don't echo Gundo so at that number yina. Tashin jictaching netang de la leptu te yes song.
Now, in terms of a practitioner who, for example, during his life has developed great devotion for or trust and confidence in an enlightened spiritual guide. Examples: the Black Crown Guru and the Red Crown Guru, being the Karmapa and the Shamarpa. That person, throughout his lifetime, because of his trust and confidence in the enlightened spiritual guide, will have frequently prayed to and supplicated the Guru, and at this stage, as to the in-between state, he's in the habit of doing so, and will therefore connect with the spiritual influence of the Guru, who then can guide him to a good rebirth. And in this way, this individual will not encounter circumstances that inspire fear and panic, rather the opposite.
Today in the denser that lama jestamba yidam jestamba singen deya tu don nekap kundu semla kam gore.
So therefore it's very important to, at all times and in all situations, recollect the Guru, recollect the Yidam.
Pena pe shubina senyalu kabla melam jik surunga ji mendu dedu lama train to vachona pesher badu nekam naya lama ta yidam yes train to vachi yongyo degas ji kamcha sal.
An example which would describe the level of this kind of habit that one needs in order for it to function the way just described as to the in-between state would be the following. Think of, while you sleep, that you're in the grip of a horrible nightmare. If, when sleeping, while in the grip of a horrible nightmare, you're able to turn your attention to the Guru or the Yidam, if you have that capacity during a nightmare, then probably or presumably you would be able to do the same in the in-between state.
Tene daga na shinge ndoti nanda satsu mebe shosu nen ro songare. Etsika.
Did I? All I satsu mebe.
Satsu mepa sade nga tan denen ro de penna sanen de chilan ro samsum ge den samno chi yor besna pardu semjen te yo mare
ore da kala lege me
ya marang de chaji san yo mare kan sem chamba ter lem ro.
Further, in this quotation, the Jewel Ornament says the following, quoting what the Buddha said, that the deceased individual who's in the in-between state is in a state where he's not able at all to even think of or planning where to go to. He's blown about, as it were, by the winds of karma. And as has been explained in previous sessions, the moment he thinks of a place, he finds himself there, even though when he thought about the place in question, it wasn't because he had any intention to go there. But as has been explained earlier, he simply finds himself there, and that's rather terrifying.
Lasso, tene, that tende captela, tene that jamkinte, tambe chumato yomare, songa jarbuda.
So the Buddha continued addressing his disciple, the king.
That take gablan, desong do attendo.
Mari, can do something. Yes.
Tea gabla, randa, jamkinte, tambe chumato, yin yomare.
The Buddha told his disciple here, the king, that it is only the sacred Buddha Dharma that can protect you from those fears at this time. There is nothing else or no other agent, as it were, with the power to help you out of this situation.
That in Regan Ekaptala, Ben should like Peki, that Pin Pincha Pugu, that in Zoge, Gewatzawa, Sapa Yina, Young Shivotella, Pinchita told you.
Now, if at this point family members left behind decide to sponsor virtuous actions in the name of the deceased person, that will benefit the deceased person in this situation.
Pendishivina de Tanda Jamden de Rajgil Yugabla Kung Lama Pagwasharipu Tangi Song Dunget and the Seviche to Yang in Song Peggy.
Or Sharipu.
Sharipu. Then a linche Yavu Kapis Toncher Gishiro La compared to the pay Yedam Botongatala.
Panginyetrila?
Toncher Gishilo
Rajgirk. Dina Sigdeore.
Zigdeore.
Yida ina Nedegor.
Ya Nedegor. Yida pe Manguchi ne. Te Papa Sharipu get things and Shinjalam console. That chinzo Dungan the Kandesha Johnson's Kandanandra. That console link pure Nazo Pesha, Sere la Besha, la Besha, Nazo producer San Tongimento, Nazo Teleshechane, Yedal Jason Shure.
Pujula Mateva chain a Besha.
That Pujula Tem Matu all over the Shelas of Showing. That day in the Tagate Java in Naya. Pujutins okay, gave a short maton, me gave a short pejotank dose. Then answer leg, that the region young dose. Lovely. Then it check in Jim meaning answer poo pujul, the link link number of nos.
Now, at one point, when the Buddha, the Bhagavan, was staying in the city-state of Rajgir, his close disciple, the Arhat Shariputra, having moved to the outskirts of the city, at one time, I presume by way of his capacity as to foreknowledge, became aware of a large group of pretas living on the outskirts of the city. And by way of his attainment, he was able to communicate with them, and apparently they were in horrific circumstances, and he asked them, what is it that caused you to end up in this way? And so they had explained to him that most of them, if not all, were individuals who in their previous lives as human beings had been very successful in accumulating wealth, which in those days primarily meant gold, silver, and the like. Perhaps they were traders. The story doesn't tell us how, but that they informed Shariputra of this, and also told him that all of us became exceedingly attached to the wealth we had amassed, to the point where some of us hid it. So not even our family members now have any idea of the fortunes or the wealth we've amassed and hidden. Some of them said that they had not resorted to hiding their wealth, but their family members had inherited the wealth they had amassed. However, the family members did not use the wealth for virtuous purposes, rather the opposite, and that then influenced them or impacted them in this way. And they asked Shariputra to seek out their family members, and for the ones who were unaware of the wealth that had been hidden, inform them of where it had been hidden so that they could retrieve it and make good use of it. And for the ones who then suffered primarily because of their wealth being used for non-virtuous purposes, they asked Shariputra to inform their family members of this and change their ways.
Tene linde kurre linde kurne nahme sosol linde je mangcha yi che chegyo mare tenjai che da jeg mare nganche thong ma chung se ro ta da men me nam to yor wa tende she.
So Shariputra visited the various families, informed them of what you've just been told, and most of them reacted with disbelief. They said, "No, cannot be. We have never seen these pretas." Their reaction was one of disbelief.
That jamden del shune can't agres.
Nangme.
Mare Sharipu shures. Shariputra
went to Buddha Shakyamuni and said, "What am I to do? Because those people do not believe me, and therefore their deceased family members can't be helped."
Family member
So Buddha Shakyamuni called upon all those family members.
Then consulted on the Jamde thing and single love ne. Then Yeda get Tenso game, Conso Surtung, Consoyan Yeda Patung to be.
And by way of his meditative powers, as it were, the Buddha made it possible for the family members to see those pretas who were the reincarnations of their deceased family members.
Tene that consider family members and so Yeda tung the doctor turn
now those family members reacted with fear and ran off simply. They couldn't bear seeing what they saw.
Then Yeda tenso laguya to German or Charanso Pai, Charanso Mai,
Of course, in appearance, they were not recognizable, in that they were now, their appearance was now a different one from previously. However, the pretas called out as their family members were running off, saying, I was your father, this was my name, I was so, and so on, and sort of identified themselves.
Tene, ta konzo te labdu ta yi che ne, tene konzo jose tenzo jemba tang ya sanje ni te so le chepa pu, tene ngenong le jemba shuk jemba tang ne, yeda ta tala yue be yeda te kanga jewa pu ne, tene sanje loma chaso.
And the family members left behind in the world of human beings understood, and they did exactly as they were instructed by their deceased family members, now pretas, and acts of generosity and the like were performed. Which then and those pretas, in consequence of the good actions done on their behalf, were able to take rebirth as human beings. And became disciples of Buddha Shakyamuni and attained various levels of realization. So virtuous actions on behalf of deceased individuals can be very powerful.
제간나지 동해 시대 마슈 살아제 다 데레 어둠 매바여도 다니 두파당 잘외 둥알 양요래 제
Then if you remember from the list yesterday of 8 basic types of suffering, we've come to number 5, which is correct.
다 나랑게 다 보모 dropo dromo kakhandro gidungai.
Which is about the kind of suffering experienced because of parting with near and dear ones, being separated from them.
대간나 신기 딴데 separated 보모 dropo dromo 찍고 말에 랑게 롱바당 달고에 둥에 랑게 조세당 달고에 둥에 라서 망고요.
This kind of suffering also applies to having to leave your homeland behind. One may be very fond of one's homeland. Having to leave one's home, one's wealth, and so on and so forth. Having to leave everything behind.
Tene ta ni dupadang trabe dungal. Ta dram medupadang trebe dungal songade.
Next, there is the suffering which happens because of unwanted circumstances.
다 ngara dada trende chani yo marete dada tre teleten tappa tsepa ta den dongwa dekpala sup dungal pangdu me baji yungdo.
If one encounters a fierce enemy, for example, an unwanted circumstance, one may end up being beaten up badly, being drawn into a conflict, and so on and so forth. There are many types of suffering possible in consequence of encountering a fierce enemy.
Tene Depa sarchang minye dungal chevre.
Then there is suffering because of not being able to obtain that which one seeks to obtain.
Tache dayan nungche te pemi jigurten tse mise korang la leka le dene rangin depa king to wache tadong minye dunga shira yore.
Now, among human beings, it's very common that the majority, if not more or less all human beings, work hard throughout their entire lives in order to improve their living standard and what all of that involves. But they never get to the point where they are satisfied with what they've achieved. So it's about a lifelong struggle, working very hard to get or to obtain what one would like to obtain, but not really being able to do so.
Tan depa de se ne ta ching depa kingan ra bu thobe on to tang na ta yang te nyam sho jere ten te songchap chebe dunge chig yung kre.
Of course, there are some successful individuals who get to where they wanted to get to. However, then another type of suffering may set in, namely the one which results from working very hard to maintain that which has been achieved.
Pen na shewala song re junor singen de tongbo sak ka la dunge ji yore chepre.
The Indian Buddhist master Shantideva said, to begin with, when working hard for the sake of, for example, accumulating wealth, there is a lot of suffering involved.
Tene bhartu sak sarvate songchap che dungal chi yore chepre.
Once one has succeeded, then another type of suffering sets in, the one resulting from the efforts one has to make to maintain what one has amassed, or the wealth one has amassed.
Tamati chik la shona yangchar dungal chik legre songre.
And if all is one day lost, the stock market sinks, for example, then there is the suffering of having lost all of that.
Tauna yakshu te karisana nor tsongmen one yakshu te cho shepe nor singedre.
So, what's the best that one could obtain then? What would a suffering-free possession be? Well, Shantideva said, contentment.
Tanganto de cho shepe loji yuan na karichena yanganzo semtel dechik ji yore.
An individual who's content with what he has doesn't suffer.
Pena pangye pe shubi na nganzo chongdu kapge dejongbe chongseble ngone jibo yore chongsep den zol. Tanda na shin ke nor longcho kaya yo ma de sajun ri se tongjun ri si ji yore de yina konza sem de jibo shira yore. Ta kangan zam sade ta doru ron ten same da with dunge de yore.
Khenpo Rinpoche gives an example from his childhood. He grew up in the northern Indian state of Sikkim. And during his childhood, life was very simple there. People had their fields, they grew their own vegetables, rice and whatnot. And people were quite content at the time with what they had. Then later on, things have changed. We're now in the era of the so-called modern world, and many parts of the previously so-called third world, nowadays called the developing world, their circumstances have changed a lot. And Khenpo Rinpoche says he has the impression that when he visits his childhood village and other areas of Sikkim, people are not at all that happy and content anymore. Conclusion, simply because they are no longer content with what they have. They want more, because that's what the world is about right now. Now, a person whose mindset conforms with the principles of the Buddha Dharma will be a person of contentment.
So that
ends the explanations of some of the various types of suffering human beings experience. Then we have the so-called demigods and their circumstances in terms of suffering. There are two basic categories of them, or two basic types of them. The category of the higher level of the two, their circumstances are quite similar to the very good circumstances of the gods. Whereas those of the lower level of the two, even though circumstances are not circumstances of poverty and the like, they do have what they need and a bit more. There is greater suffering than on the other level, or suffering caused by the higher degree of ignorance, as it were, that they are plagued by. Their mindsets are both dense and dull. Therefore, this group of demigods are sometimes categorized as demigods of an animal type, and if you remember, it's a dense and dull mindset that is the predominant afflictive, obscuring state of animals. So it may not be that these demigods, in terms of physique, resemble animals. It's more about the state of their mindset resembling the mindset of animals, perhaps. There is a type of being known in terms of India and the setup, as it were, or the kinds of beings known by those who live on the Indian subcontinent. And the name for this kind of being is Naga. And Buddhism also speaks of this type of being. It may be that in other parts of the world, those living there do not have knowledge of this type of being. However, in terms of the Indian subcontinent, everyone has knowledge of this kind of being called Naga.
That you tell la the mantra tu la yang dungarchi
And Nagas are categorized as demigods.
Then Naga tenzo la tu la dungal yang mongbo yongi.
Now, from time to time, as in all worldly existences, Nagas, these kind of demigods, are subjected to different kinds of suffering. In particular, because of disease.
Lasso, tene, ta lama yin tela, cheta, ladon shondrava yinsa, flag dungal won shekre, dedan chandrava dunga yore sungat, shondrava.
Sula.
Lama yin.
Datanda lusekindi.
Lama yin konto yinba.
Re, tene?
Tene chetan lama yin de plai risk stop che yorwa.
Gangla yekindi.
Yeah.
Then there is the higher level of demigods, and the types of suffering they experience are much like the types of suffering experienced by the gods.
God
however, there is another set of 3 types of suffering that they in specific experience.
Console ngajal shirayot. Ngajal shirayo beche. Ngajal tig juchene. Fly banjor longcho la. Tradu gesem petru digi.
In terms of their mental state, they experience a great deal of ups and downs. Because of their pride in their good circumstances, but knowing that the gods have even better circumstances makes them jealous. And a mindset of jealousy is not a mindset of happiness or well-being. It's the experiencing of perturbation because of one's jealousy. And their jealousy has such a force to it that they on and off wage war with the gods in the hope of taking over that realm. And of course, in the course of warfare, there will be injuries, death and the like, and suffering in that context. So that's all for today.
Sunam de damje zegwane tomne yebe danam pamje jegana je balav to waye sigbe cholen do waye do